Hello, everybody, and welcome to another bonus stream here at twitch.tv/purblindgamer, where we will be continuing the exciting and peculiar mystery novel, CRATER'S GOLD. I hope that everybody is doing well tonight. I know it's tax day, which is stressful for people, and yeah, I've got a lot of other stuff going on. The bus I took broke down while I was on my commute home tonight, and I found out I have to be in the office 2 hours early tomorrow. Why? I can't tell you. It's a trade secret. It's also mildly annoying. But I did too wired to go to sleep, so I thought I should still do a bonus stream since I can. There'll be other nights that I can't, but it will indeed be a short one. And just an hour, if that. And thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple of streams. We continued Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil on Sunday, and played a couple of random horror games on Saturday, Toxic Tomb and Sub-Dread. Interesting. Yeah, Toxic Tomb is a pretty addictive game if you like those arcadey Sega Master System era type games. Why do I always seem to get congested when I'm going to do an audiobook stream? And just to remind everybody, though I have it on screen, I won't be responding to chat until the end. I have my TTS off just so I can, continue the flow of reading and make it a little easier to turn it into an actual audiobook later, which I say I'm going to do. And I've also disabled raids for the same sort of purpose. Chapter 9. "Do you know how I feel?" asked Exberger, as Styles, Miss Fuller, and he came out of the judge's house into the soft darkness of the early June night. Exberger, and Styles himself was already catching the habit, generally prefaced a statement of fact by a demand that his emotions be guessed at. The idea was that, after several preposterous guesses, he could spring his denouement and set them all right. This was not based on any conscious interest in psychology. It was not even the traditional managerial love of being an oracle. It was, rather, a deliberately cultivated habit. Like most men who have made money out of the theater, Exberger, early in his career, had discovered, to his amazement at the time, the dramatic and consequently financial value of the simple experiences of the average human mind. So, like most men who have seen the money which is made from unpretentious plays, he was continually probing his emotions with the hope that there might be $1 million in them, as there had been for this or that happy playwright. His conversation was full of stories of men who had made thousands from a single catchword overheard in the street or from one line of a song. "Do you know how I feel?" he demanded, but in the subduing influence of the June darkness nobody seemed to care how he did feel. "I feel," he said, nevertheless, "as if I had been watching some cracking good show, something solemn, Ibsen, or that sort of stuff." Even that failed to draw any response, but Exberger had his satisfaction in knowing, from their silence, that his two companions felt quite the same way. The apple blossoms were just coming into their maturity. The lilacs were at the height of theirs, and as the trio walked slowly up the dirt path at the side of the village street, the heavy scents in the velvet darkness might have been those of an evening in Southern California, in orange blossom time. After Exberger's profound confession, none of them felt much inclination to talk, and Miss Fuller, who walked between the two men, slipped a hand through the arm of each and drew them both to her snugly. Styles found it rather comforting. The path lasted only a few hundred yards, and, at its terminus, the sketchy street-lights ended, too, after which the three plunged into the dark and rutted country road which led to the crater place. The change in the footing seemed to lessen the tension, although the amazing old judge was still uppermost in the minds of them all. "What was that war he spoke about?" asked Exberger suddenly. "The one where his uncle or someone got killed." "The French and Indian War?" suggested Styles. "Yes, that's the one. What war was that?" Styles rather started. The date was only approximate in his own mind, but the event itself had been a cornerstone of his education at one point of his childhood, just as the story of Joseph and his brethren had been at an earlier point, and the Battle of Salamis at a later. He could not remember when he had not shuddered at Braddock's defeat. "I don't remember exactly the date," he replied, "but it wasn't a great while before the Revolution." "The Revolution?" asked Exberger simply. "That was Sheridan's ride and all that, wasn't it?" Styles did not laugh. It rather took him a moment to get his breath. "You're thinking of Paul Revere's ride, I guess," he suggested tactfully. "They seem to have done a lot of riding in the old days." But Exberger was too genuine in his thirst for knowledge to avail himself of the opening. "No," he insisted, "there was a Sheridan's ride, wasn't there? Barbara Fritchie or something of the sort." Styles was pinned down to exactness in spite of his well-meaning evasion. "But that was 100 years later. That wasn't so very long ago, in the Civil War." "Oh, sure," replied Exberger, a flood of light bursting on him. "I get you now. A Civil War. That was the birth of a nation. I know all about it now. Say, can you guess how much money that picture made? I wish I knew myself and had a chunk of it." He shook his head ruefully that he had not investigated American history, at least to the extent of owning a chunk in The Birth of a Nation, but his mind was tenacious, and he pursued the new line of thought as avidly as he had pursued his antiquarian studies. "Then Paul Revere was in this French and Indian War? What did he do?" If Styles had not lived 15 years in the heart of New York, he would not have believed his ears at that moment, and, as it was, even he was startled. If he ever wanted to use this thing as a dinner story, he knew that no one would ever believe him. A man who, to a partial extent, controlled the destinies of the American stage, a man, at any rate, who wore the clothes and had the habits of wealth and position, a man whose verdict was feared and whose judgment respected by some of the best wit of New York, did not know things which were taught to 6-year-old tots in the little red schoolhouses around Eton. The basis of society crumbled, but still he managed, in an impersonal voice, to give a rough outline of American history. Nathan Hale, Exberger knew, because someone had written a play of that name. Would lose money today. Those costume plays always do. Lincoln, of course, he had heard of, and Grant, of popular song fame, and Washington in connection with the Delaware episode. But whether Columbus and Napoleon or Columbus and Oliver Cromwell were contemporaries was a matter on which he was shady in the extreme. Said he was. To all of Styles's discourses Miss Fuller listened with polite attention, but without much interest. "I learned some of those things once," she said, "but I was never any good at remembering dates." Like most women who dress well, Miss Fuller regarded ignorance as a kind of virtue. It was easy to see why. Women who did know dates and that sort of thing were notoriously dowdy. Ergo, like all women, moreover, those who dress well and those who don't, she felt that the only knowledge in good repute was that which came from innate instinct. Book knowledge, they say, in a voice which shows that it is the last source of wisdom to be taken as authoritative. Once interested in a thing, however, Exberger, the male, was a hound for knowledge. Like a lawyer in a careful cross-examination, he drew out from Styles the essential facts of Miles Standish and John Alden. In that half a mile they had almost reached the Missouri Compromise. It was thrilling to Exberger. He actually felt that he had touched a little-known side of human knowledge. He would tell people about this sometime. The beauty was that he did not, from first to last, show any surprise at his own ignorance. He questioned Styles simply, as one questions a mining expert, or an aviator, or a man who has been to Tibet, or, in fact, any master of a remote and not very useful subject. There were, of course, people who went in for this Nathan Hale stuff, and they weren't all hicks either. He could be liberal. There was no accounting for tastes. But now that he himself, a practical man, knew about it, just wait. There might be a play in that French and Indian stuff, a screenplay, that is, and a comic song in Cotton Mather and the Witches, something bringing in a man who was afraid of his wife. Just look at Rip Van Winkle, what that made. It simply coined the stuff. Cotton Mather was a wise old guy. He burned them at the stake. A refrain something like that, sung by a good comedian who knew how to get it over. Nothing to it, boy, nothing to it. It gave Exberger the joy of the investigator, the sense of having plumbed the hitherto unplumbed. He had a headful, and without troubling to go into the Mexican-American War, he relapsed, after half a mile, into silence, but full of thought, deep stuff. For 100 yards or so nobody said anything, and then it developed that depths in Miss Fuller's nature had also been stirred. "Mr. Styles, do you believe in ghosts?" It needed no explanation to show what had started the question. From the judge's full evening, Exberger had come away with Nathan Hale under his arm, Miss Fuller with the story of the crater ghost. She made no pretense that it did not worry her. It was not a flippant question. The girl was troubled. "Mr. Styles, do you believe in ghosts?" Styles hesitated. If they had been alone, he would have given her at once a sincere answer, for, to tell the truth, he had thought about the question more than once. Who had not? He stumbled along the road a moment or two, and then decided to do it anyway. "I'll tell you frankly how I feel about that. I don't see how a man can be a Christian and believe in any kind of spirits." The minute he had said it, he realized his mistake, but the next minute realized that he had not made any mistake at all. Exberger was not a Christian, yet curiously he did not realize that he was not. He accepted the term in just the sense that Styles had used it. For both of them, New Yorkers, Christian had become synonymous with white man. It meant little more than one who lived in a civilized country. The tone in which Exberger voiced his next question showed Styles that he had been exactly right. "What do you mean that a man can't be a Christian?" Just what Styles had thought, in the term he assumed himself. In his answer, Styles was on safe ground. The Decalogue was Jewish as well. "We are told in the Bible," he said, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. If you believe in God, you are forbidden to pay any attention to any other spirit. They are not recognized, so to speak." Styles himself had gone into the matter further than that, St. Paul and "ye men of Athens," but he did not think it necessary to elaborate this far. "But if you don't believe in God?" asked Exberger. His tone did not imply in the least that he himself did not. He merely had picked a possible flaw in the logic, like the good businessman that he was. But imagine Miss Fuller asking such a question as that, on a dark night, on a country road, on the way to a haunted house. Miss Fuller drew closer to Styles, if anything, and Styles gave to the question an answer that was perfectly devout and was also impeccable theology. "If I didn't believe in God," he replied, "I'd waste mighty little time with any other spirit." Chapter 10. The story which Judge Tyler had told about the old crater place had, in fact, appealed to Styles principally for the quaint precision with which it was told. So far as the plot was concerned, the young bride, the jealous husband, the fit of anger, and the spirit which came back to haunt the spot, it was an old, old tale. There was one unfortunate fact over which even the judge had been obliged to express a literary regret. The house was not the same one. The house in which Styles was living had, as he had imagined, been built in the 40s, while the legend concerned itself with the time of the Revolution. "The first thing that made me believe that this paper wa'n't real," the judge had said, relative to the Stylesian forgery, "was that there never was no Nicholas Crater, leastways so far as I ever heard, and I've been searching titles in this township for upwards of 50 years. Come Michaelmas," Styles had added softly. "Your uncle never had no brothers," the judge had explained, "and his father, old Major Crater, he never had none. He was the man that built that house you live in now. Before that there was a house about 10 rod to the east, at the top of the hill. That wa'n't tore down till after I was quite a little boy. You can see part of the cellar there yet." "I wondered what that was," Styles had said. "There's a white lilac bush there." "And has been ever since I can remember," the judge had remarked, with a smile. "That's the bush that the spirit is supposed to come and water when the flowers is in bloom." "They're in bloom now," Miss Fuller had exclaimed with a start. At that moment had begun her air of depression which had, an hour later, brought forth her timid inquiry. "Old man Crater, he built that house," the judge had repeated, "and his father was Zebulon Crater. He married a Gilson, but I never heard much about him. It was his father's brother, his older brother, Solomon Crater, that they told the story about." Solomon Crater, so it appeared, had been a much more dashing young man than his ponderous name would imply. As one filled out the picture from the judge's meagre and literal description, he had been a man to go about the countryside, slapping his boot with his riding-whip, frequenting the taverns, and pinching the cheeks of the wenches. He had also been an officer in the Continental line, fired, no doubt, by the example of that selfsame ancestor of the judge who had been so harshly treated by the French or the Injuns, one or the other, at Fort William or Fort Henry, the judge disremembered which. As records run in New England, the Revolution seems to have been a most accommodating sort of war. Soldiers practically commuted from home to the battlefields, while officers, who were professional men, had time to build up a practice between campaigns. Solomon Crater, for one, went clear to South America and back, and the West Coast at that, between roll calls, and brought back a bride. This was odd, in light of the present day, that this young Granadan lady, coming from the old civilization of South America to the rough, uncivilized country of North America, was in the position of a Parisian, say, marrying a man from New Zealand. After the vice-regal life of Bolivia, as it was later, the Provincial Society of Massachusetts bored her to extinction. The point was that when young Solomon Crater came rolling in from Schuyler's army after a battle or two in the North Country, he found that the viper had entered his home. No written town records touched on the affair at all. The local Don Juan had not even left his name to history. There was merely the tradition of the strangling by night, and then the young lady who came out to water the lilacs, frightening passers in the darkness by muttering strange words, in Spanish, presumably, such being the language of Bolivia, as it was later. "And what's become of the husband?" Exberger had asked, pertinently enough. On that the judge was hazy. All such local legends are hazy on matters of criminal jurisprudence. The unwritten law, with reverse English, seems to have stood without question. One liked to think that the husband met his death by riding his horse over a cliff on a dark and stormy night, chased by remorse. It would have spoiled the story to have learned that he had merely been frowned on by local opinion, and had died in his bed of organic trouble, as Styles privately believed that he had. At any rate, the tale held together sufficiently to give Miss Fuller an hour full of solemn thoughts, before they stumbled up the steps of the old Crater place. Over a dim light in the kitchen still sat Mrs. Fields, somewhat en negligee, waiting their coming. She had fallen asleep half a dozen times, and, nodding over the candle, she appeared unusually crone-like. "About those old papers," shouted Styles at once, awakening her from a doze. "Why didn't you tell me that Judge Tyler brought them all back?" Mrs. Fields, as a part of her negligee, had removed her false teeth. "You didn't ask me," she replied, unabashed. Chapter 11. In the study was a parlor lamp which gave as much heat as a full-size stove, and Styles and his guests gravitated back to it much as they would have done to an open fire. Miss Fuller was frankly and openly nervous, and while the two men were both equally preoccupied, they showed it in ways which illustrated oddly their completely contrasted characters and training. With a weight on his mind, the first impulse of Styles was to sit in a chair, unmoving, until his problem was solved. Faced by mental unrest, Exberger's impulse required him to keep on his feet and moving. So now he walked back and forth until he exclaimed, "Say, where is this old house that the judge was telling about?" Styles looked at Miss Fuller, but, seeing her, outwardly at least, somewhat composed, he rose to his feet. "I'll show you," he said. Miss Fuller rose hastily too. "You don't think I'm going to stay here all alone, do you?" she asked. The three went out to the unpainted piazza where, in the now cooling June night, Styles pointed out a series of vague mounds at the far side of what had once been the lawn. There was little left of the old house now, even of the foundations. By daylight, one found snatches of stone wall and an irregular hole, half filled in, the whole surrounded by turf banks sloping up to it, like a gun rampart. By night, one saw only the vague moundish shapes, but, rather startlingly at this moment, the white lilac bush, like a misty white scarf, picked itself out of the darkness. Exberger looked at it a moment. "What say we go over and explore it?" Styles hesitated, but it was wholly on Miss Fuller's account, and Miss Fuller shook her head decisively. "I wouldn't go near that place at night for $1,000,000. "I would, for 2 cents, said Exberger boldly. "Let's go look at it, Styles." He started down the steps, but Styles was more merciful. "Oh, what's the use?" he said casually. "There's nothing there but some old stone walls." Exberger started resolutely away from the steps, but, with a sudden alarm, Miss Fuller grasped Styles's arm. "Charlie! Charlie Exberger!" she called, in a strange, shrill voice. "Don't you leave this piazza!" Exberger turned, grinning, his teeth showing in the darkness. "Oh, Rose," he pleaded, "for heaven's sake, don't be such a simp." Miss Fuller was not abashed. "I don't care whether I'm a simp or not. I'm frightened, and I don't want you to leave this piazza." "Well, I'm going anyway," retorted Exberger. He turned and started away into the darkness, and Miss Fuller commanded, "Charlie, come back here this instant." She turned to Styles. "Mr. Styles, make him come back." Styles did not see how he was going to do that, but he did manage to call, "Oh, what's the use? There's nothing there." "Then what's the harm in going?" insisted Exberger. It seemed to be a matter of pure obstinacy with him now, and he strode stiffly on. Miss Fuller looked after him fearfully, but she said no more, and Styles tried to reassure her. "He'll be back in a minute. There's nothing there to hurt him." For a moment or two they stood there watching the white collar of Exberger, the only part of him now visible, vanishing under the shadows of the apple trees of the old lawn. Miss Fuller clutching Styles's arm. As the darkness finally closed over the speck of white, the girl shuddered slightly. She was a strangely different figure now from the self-possessed woman who had come that afternoon. "It's cold here," she said, in a voice slightly trembling, and after the heat of the great parlor lamp, it was rather shivery. "We'd better go in," suggested Styles. With a kindly instinct, he was making his voice as matter-of-fact and as protecting as possible. Reluctantly, the girl turned and went in beside him. "I do hope he's all right," she said again, anxiously, as she took her seat in that same rattan chair which she had occupied when Styles first saw her, but which was now placed across the table from his own. Sitting there on both sides of the lamp, their aspect was strangely domestic. Styles noticed it, but the girl was apparently busy with her uneasy thoughts. "I suppose I am silly," she said, "but I can't help it." And then, as always happens in cases where one of a party is the prey of such fears, they immediately began to tell all the supernatural tales in their repertoires, each one worse than the last. At least, Miss Fuller told all of hers, for Styles saw early the wisdom of not adding to a state which was keyed up enough as it was. Miss Fuller's stories were such as are told with shudders and frightened eyes in every stage dressing-room, revelations of mediums and premonitions of death. Styles wisely said nothing, except to remark once or twice, "That is strange," until in the warmth of their growing intimacy the girl turned to him suddenly. "How do you account for those things?" She put the question in implicit trust, a trust that was almost pathetic. Just why she should turn to him as authority both she and Styles understood vaguely, but neither could have told. Styles was simply that kind of a man. In all gentleness he assumed the trust. Before he knew it, he was delving, in simple words, into pure metaphysics. He touched the great law of coincidence. He instanced the atheist who had said that, if he were given enough type and enough throws, he could throw Virgil's Aeneid from a dice-box. Only, in his version, Styles did not use the Aeneid. He called it Webster's Dictionary. It took Miss Fuller some time to get the force of this argument, and when she did get it, she doubted it on practical grounds. "But a man wouldn't live long enough to throw more than a few million times, and suppose he got it all right except one letter, he would still have to begin throwing all over again, and he might not come anywhere near it again for 10 years. At which, of course, Styles had to explain the nature of infinity and pure reason. He did not know how much the girl understood, but at least she listened, fascinated by his choice of words. "You do know a lot, don't you?" she said, with a little sigh, and having at last found the fount of all abstract knowledge, she proceeded to put to it several serious problems which she had been saving up in the past, for a medium presumably. "What do you think love really is?" was the first one. "Exists there a man and exists there a girl who could not do justice to a topic like that around a glowing lamp in a country house at 11 at night?" Miss Fuller, by this time, was leaning her elbow on the table, her chin in her hand, looking at Styles intently with her eyes open wide and with the expression like that of a little girl. Of all the strange and unexpected conversations which Styles had had in that dishevelled room, this was the strangest. His 15 years of newspaper life in New York had made Styles metropolitan in his knowledge rather than in his habits. Like most newspaper men, his thrills had been vicarious. He had remained the observer rather than the participant. The girl before him he knew well enough by type, the show-girl type, he would have called it. He had seen her by dozens at roof gardens and on the motor roads of Long Island on Sunday afternoons. Smart, beautiful, and sophisticated, to have entertained her in her customary habitat would rather have frightened him. Here in his own house she sat before him, disclosed as nothing more than a wistful, simple girl who put her chin in her hand and listened to his very elementary philosophy as a girl from a little town in the Mississippi basin might have listened to his tales of newspaper life in New York. From her face, as he saw it without the mask, Styles tried to guess from what atmosphere she really had sprung. A factory village in Upper Vermont? A flat in Harlem over a delicatessen store? It might have been either. "I haven't had such a good talk in ages," exclaimed Miss Fuller, as Styles came to the end of his argument, and of a truth she had not. Conversation for her, as it is for most of her world, had been merely a fragmentary observation of the things which passed before her eyes. With men and women of the kind she had known, it is rare that 3 consecutive sentences are spoken on the same subject. A thought is never followed to its conclusion, and wit consists of burlesquing and parodying the words of the last one who has spoken. No wonder that Styles appeared to her in the light of an oracle. "I could talk like this for a week," she added, with growing enthusiasm, but as she spoke, the old Ansonia clock in the kitchen wheezed out 12, and the 2 of them, in amazement, counted the strokes. Styles took out his watch, as one does, to verify the count, and smiled as he said, 12 o'clock. 12 o'clock, echoed the girl, and as it dawned on her, her eyes grew startled. What in the world has become of Charlie Exberger? The question had leaped to Styles's mind before she had spoken. They sat there for a moment in silence, looking at each other in vague alarm. Then from outside the house came an ear-piercing shriek. There followed a confused murmur of dulled, shouting voices, another moment of silence, and then a terrific explosion. Chapter 12. One would suppose that men who had been intimate with motors for 10 or 15 years would learn that it is rather artless to play around a gasoline tank with a lighted match, but some of them never seem to. One sees their names in the papers from time to time, with a list of the clubs to which they belonged. The explosion outside the house brought Styles and Miss Fuller to their feet with a simultaneous bound, but, in spite of the fact that the shriek and then the report followed immediately on their ghostly conversation and on the spectral errand undertaken by Exberger, neither had any thought of elves or gnomes as they rushed from the house, the girl quite as resolute as the man. Their eyes blinded for a moment by the sudden darkness, they felt their way, hand in hand, to the gate, but in the road at the foot of the hill they saw figures moving hurriedly back and forth, and heard the sound of panting voices. The red tail-light of a car showed in the road itself, and, as they got nearer, the bundled figure of a woman could be seen in the seat. Her voice could be heard, giving decisive directions. The explanation of what actually had happened was probably never given in full. It is quite unnecessary. Knowing Exberger, knowing Puller, one could build up the scene from the scantest details. Given a man like Exberger standing in meditation beside a demoralized motor, given a man like Puller coming up in his own car and catching sight of the wreck, and what do you have? Genial nods in the darkness, offers to be of assistance, full and graphic accounts of the accident, intimate details of fractured springs and distorted differentials, reminiscences of former accidents to the party of the first part, and former accidents to the party of the second part, a few pipes lighted, a few cigars offered, matches held courteously between cupped hands, an invitation to inspect the fallen colossus in full, and then the match ignited about 6 inches away from the punctured feed pipe. When Styles and Miss Fuller came down on the run, Exberger and Puller were still throwing sand, but the fire was under control. Luckily, Puller's wife, a woman who tied trout flies and gloated over motors as enthusiastically as Puller himself, had seen the spark fall just in time. Hers had been the shriek which had caused both men to jump out of danger just before the explosion occurred. She had even snatched the extinguisher from the dash of her own car and had passed it out to her husband. In that you have Mrs. Puller to the life, a woman who would talk motors at 12 at night, who would buy an extinguisher out of a catalogue and attach it proudly to the dash of her car, who would think of it in a crisis and then shout efficient directions. For the rest, she was a perfect wife for a country gentleman, a regal, handsome woman with greying hair, who looked 10 years older than her husband, and was an expert in the jargon of country house life, a Lady Bountiful, whose exceedingly genial to the happy peasantry, as long as they kept strictly in mind the fact that they were the happy peasantry. Styles had a fair idea of what had occurred a dozen yards before he arrived on the scene, but Miss Fuller was misty. "Charlie, are you hurt? Are you hurt, Charlie?" she kept calling in a voice which rose rapidly into the upper register. On occasions of accident, women, even women like Miss Fuller, have no shame about showing legitimate alarm. What made it different, and Exburger was already in the deprecatory stage. With men it is different, and Exburger was already in the deprecatory stage. He did not show it, perhaps, as either Styles or Puller would have done. His Turkish manner broke through. "No, there's nothing the matter at all," he said curtly, as then, as Rose's voice sailed higher and higher, he almost commanded, "For heaven's sake, Rose, nobody's hurt. Don't make such a fuss." With Mrs. Puller within hearing, Styles wished that Exburger had not spoken in just that way. Presumably Miss Fuller herself wished it too. She lapsed into silence like a child reproved before strangers, and Styles, in a sudden sympathy, took her arm. They stood there while Puller beat out the last of the sparks. Then both of the firefighters came toward them. "Narrow squeak," said Puller proudly. He had really enjoyed the affair. "The feed pipe must have been struck by the camshaft when the cylinders came up through the truss rods backwards, if you know what I mean." The clinic on motors was apparently about to be taken up, just where it had been broken off by the explosion, but Mrs. Puller must have made a move in the darkness that only her husband saw. "Oh, I beg your pardon," said the latter hurriedly. "Mr. Styles, may I present you to my wife?" Mrs. Puller turned amiably from her seat in the car. "How do you do, Mr. Styles? I've heard a great deal about you." But Styles had learned a lesson that day, and he hastened to lead Rose into the light of the car lamp. "This is Miss Fuller," he said, and, as Exburger straightened himself expectantly in the background, he added with a gesture, "Mr. Exburger you apparently already know." Even in the darkness Styles could see Puller start, and realize that, like the judge, the agent had entertained the mysterious Mr. Exburger quite unawares. Puller, however, covered it up, as the judge had not done. "We did not know that it was Mr. Exburger," he said gracefully. There followed an awkward pause, but just as that day had made Exburger an enthusiastic antiquarian, so had that day made Styles an incurable host. "Why don't you all come up to the house?" he exclaimed. Almost before the words had left him, he felt a twitch at his arm, where Miss Fuller's arm touched it. The twitch was probably involuntary, but the meaning behind it was not. Showgirl or no showgirl, Miss Fuller had seen instantly complications in the invitation which had not appeared to Styles's coarser masculine sense. Mrs. Fields, as a chaperone, might not rank as high in these people's minds as she did in his. Mrs. Puller apparently saw complications too. "You're awfully good," she began in the way which means, "but under no circumstances," but Puller, like Styles, saw only the masculine point of view. "It's terribly late," he suggested, yet in a way which seemed to mean, "We'd be delighted." Exburger cast the chairman's vote. "Oh, come ahead," he urged enthusiastically. "None of us could sleep now." With this plausible opinion, the minority report of the feminine left was not even heard. Between the three men, the thing was voted and passed, and, leaping into his own car beside his wife, Puller began backing up the hill, for, like all expert motorists, his chief delight was to drive his car backwards, and fast. "Nice fellow," said Exburger approvingly, as, with Miss Fuller and Styles, he followed on foot. "That woman would be quite good-looking," answered Rose, "if it weren't for her mouth." "He's not so bad," said Puller from his seat in the car. "Oh, he's all right," said his wife, "but that woman is common as mud." On the surface, however, nothing hampered the verve of the midnight party. Soda biscuits were found, and a virgin cake. In fact, if it had not been for that involuntary twitch at his arm, Styles would never have guessed that anything save mutual admiration lay under the careful politeness with which his guest and Mrs. Puller accorded each other. As it was, he found himself watching the older woman a little jealously. Puller and his wife were again in evening clothes, and the agent, who always seemed boyishly eager to anticipate Styles's observations, explained them shamefacedly. "Dinner again tonight, but you mustn't think that we are as giddy as this all the time." It had, however, began to occur to Styles that there must be much more in Eden than he had wot of. Probably the same idea was occurring to Exberger. His mental picture of this hick real estate agent, who had lost Baumgarten's money, Baumgarten sweating blood the while, was hardly borne out by the life. He was frankly impressed by the evening clothes, and coyed his own manner to fit the elegant company. Easy detachment, careless familiarity with money and fame, this was the air at which he aimed, and, the marvel of such men, the one which he almost attained. No, he did not bother about the car. Seeing that Puller had held the fatal match, Puller had been rather anxious about it. Besides, there was the insurance. It all came back to a simple informal gathering. One's $10,000 cars did get smashed occasionally. All of them admitted that and dismissed it. Exberger was in his element, completely happy, but, since that involuntary twitch at his arm, Styles had been on his guard. And Rose? Since the day she had left her home to ride in managers' cars, had there ever been a moment when Rose had not been on her guard? "Are you going to be long in town, Mr. Exberger?" By the careless manner in which Mrs. Puller asked it, one would not naturally impute anything except indifferent politeness, but, being warmed, the question put the whole gathering on the alert, all save Exberger. Styles became furiously busy with his soda biscuits and plates. "No, thank you, I couldn't possibly," said Mrs. Puller. She held up a biscuit still untouched to prove her case, and, with the vindictive precision of such women, she let nothing divert her from her seemingly innocent question. Puller looked unhappy and anxiously apologetic, as he always seemed forced to look in Styles's presence. Poor chap, it is very difficult to be a diplomat and a man among men when one has a wife with graying hair and fixed ideas about the lower classes. As to Rose, Rose stared, apparently unheeding, smiling vaguely, at the carpet, or what was left of it. But just as Rose had a way with being cynical silently, so did Styles imagine that she could be very uncomfortable while smiling innocently at the floor. Alone among them, Exberger beamed like a sandboy and took the question for what it seemed, just an innocent expression of genial "come and be one of us." There was no way to stop the man. "Only tonight," he replied to the question. "Rose and I were just prospecting around the country." Please, Mrs. Puller," began Styles. "Some cake or something. More seltzer. I can get it in a minute." Abominable woman, she did not even divert her attention to answer. She held up the still unbitten biscuit and hung sweetly on Exberger's words. Her flattering attention was the breath of life to Exberger. "Rose and I have been all over the country in that little old car," he boasted. But there is a point at which any woman must fight. "All over the country, meaning everywhere between Stanford and Garden City," explained Rose, still smiling sweetly. "My dear child, I know what you mean," exclaimed Mrs. Puller, and she made it quite evident that she did know. One gave it up. Let Exberger talk. He could not make it any worse than it was. "Of course, I've got to be in the city tomorrow. Those squareheads of mine would ruin me if I left them alone. But I'm coming back. Believe me, I'm coming back, Mrs. Puller." Mrs. Puller smiled winningly. "I'm sure I hope you will." Well, you take it from me, Mrs. Puller, and you too, Mr. Puller, there isn't a prettier bit of country in America than you have right here, and I've seen them all. You can talk all you want about the Jersey coast and Long Island, where all the millionaires have their estates, but I wouldn't give 2 cents for them compared with this. Why, the last time we were up this way I said to Rose, didn't I, Rose? I said, don't tell me that you could find scenery like this on Long Island. The minute I saw this old place, I said, say, look here. Had no idea who owned it or anything. I said, say, look here. If someone who knew how to do it would only slip a few $1,000s into that old dump, it wouldn't take much, only 15 or 20,000. If someone would only put up a stone wall where that fence is, and paint that piazza, and make a lawn, and cut down 2 or 3 of those old trees, there wouldn't be a finer place in the country. Of course, you'd have to fix the plumbing, slam in a ballroom or 2. Oh, there are great possibilities, agreed Mrs. Puller. Then, with utter casualness, she turned to Styles. Oh, how neatly, said the bend of her head, these things can be done when a woman does them. But you are not going to sell the place, are you, Mr. Styles, after all these years that it has been in your family? As one varies one's voice by a hair's breadth in talking first to a child of 2 and then to a great grown man of 3, so did Mrs. Puller vary her manners in talking first to Exberger and then to Styles. Styles began to have sudden misgivings as to how his own vague past loomed in her eyes. Then, like a flash, he saw where revenge would lie. I may possibly sell, he replied. He watched the effect of the shot. Mrs. Puller was skilled. Her face said nothing, but he saw that he still had the floor. Of course, he said, if I could afford it, I would never dream of letting the place go out of my hands. But you know Mr. Exberger's reputation. Exberger looked at him suddenly and very uncertainly with wide-open eyes. If he had spoken out loud, he would have said, What do you mean, reputation? And even Rose looked up with interest. Styles let them look, and then he said sweetly, Mr. Exberger has the reputation that when he wants a thing, he generally gets it. Exberger began to breathe again. I guess that's right, he agreed. He was in on it now. Say, didn't we kid them along? Would have been what he would say after Puller and his wife were gone. As soon as he got a chance to catch Styles's eye, he would wink and draw down one side of his mouth, but Miss Fuller, who had not said a word, thought that trivial matters had been discussed long enough. Something vital had happened that night. Charlie, she asked irrelevantly, almost impatiently, what was there? In the old house, I mean. Mrs. Puller looked at her sharply. If Mrs. Puller had been Exberger, she would have said, Who told you to talk? But, being Mrs. Puller, she said nothing and studied the lace on Miss Fuller's collar. Styles leaped into the breach. We heard the story of the old crater scandal, he explained, and Exberger went to find the ghost. The ghost! Exclaimed Mrs. Puller, aghast. She looked openly at her husband, and her husband looked back. So full of alarm was her glance that even Styles was upset. Perhaps the judge had not told all there was to tell. Why, yes, he answered uncertainly. The lady who comes out to water the lilacs at night. Oh, that ghost, answered Mrs. Puller, with sudden relief. But Exberger burst into a roar. My gosh, Styles, how many ghosts do you keep? For his answer, Styles looked to Mrs. Puller, but Mrs. Puller had gathered herself. I couldn't imagine what you were talking about, she said. I had forgotten about that old legend. But she was still in such evident confusion that even Exberger had pity on her and took up the tale. Anyway, my private ghost hunt failed to make good. She had gone to see a man about a dog or something. I searched around there for the best part of an hour, and then I went down to look at the car, and that was where I met you people. I told you there was nothing there, said Styles. Wasn't I right? You were right, agreed Exberger, mocking his pious intonation. "But it must have been a whale of a house in its day. I covered every inch of the cellar." "Cellar!" exclaimed Puller, coming suddenly to life. He had a way of dreaming himself out of the conversation. He had been thinking about carburetors or spoon bait for bass. "You didn't go into that old cellar?" "I sure did go into that old cellar." "At night?" "Just before I met you." "The one at the other side of the lawn?" "The one at the other side of the lawn." Puller sat back and looked at him, holding his breath. He held it so long that all the others started in question. "But, man alive," he gasped finally, "there's a hole in that cellar 200 feet deep." Chapter 13. "I feel weak," said Exberger. He had sunk suddenly into a chair, and, while he was the only one of the company who had made a move, the entire group gave, superficially, the impression of having rushed up with towels and aromatic spirits. The entire group, with one exception. That is, for, alone among them, Rose Fuller sat unmoving, as she had for the half an hour past. Odd that this was the girl who, an hour before, had run out crying, "Charlie, Charlie," in the upper register, for now she sat looking at Exberger with just the faintest ironical squint to her eyes. One has had occasion to say several times that Rose Fuller has the ability to be cynical silently. This describes the act in the nearest that it ever reached to a physical manifestation. "Well, what about the hole?" she said at last, bluntly. The words seemed to call the entire company back to reality, and all looked at Puller. Puller, however, was not himself in large companies. He was deprecatory, if you like. "Oh, it's just a hole," he said vaguely. But the answer satisfied nobody. Holes 10 feet deep, yes, but holes 200 feet deep? No. He looked at his wife for permission, and, not receiving, at least, a refusal, he went on. "Well, some people used to say there was an old copper mine there, and then there was a tradition that there was an underground passage which was used to hide slaves escaping to Canada. Personally, I think it is nothing but an old well." Having succeeded in starting the conversation in a pertinent direction, Rose Fuller was content to let others keep it in motion. Beyond essentials, she herself did not go in much for talk. There was a moment's pause in which each face could be seen measuring, mentally, the depths of wells and copper mines, and then Exberger demanded, it now being, in a way, his hole, "Have you ever been down it?" "No," answered Puller, "nobody has, but I have shouted down it when I was a boy." "Then," asked Exberger, with reluctant doubt, "how do they know that it's 200 feet deep?" The thought that he might have fallen only 50 feet, or, say, 75, threatened to take the edge off his adventure. He was eager to have Puller stand pat on 200. "They don't know," replied Puller. "That's merely what they say." Then, with his usual manner of being miles away, and a chord from happier days having apparently been touched by that harking back to his boyhood, he added, wistfully, "There's a queer echo. You can count 8 or 9 before your voice comes back." "Ah," thought Styles, "the strange mutterings at night, in Spanish presumably, such being the language of Bolivia." But the obtuseness of the local genius struck Exberger as incredible. "But look here, man," he exclaimed. "Why couldn't somebody drop a string down it? That would tell you how deep it is." For answer, Puller smiled faintly, then looked toward his wife. Should he tell, or shouldn't he? His wife informed him promptly. "Oh, Bobby, there's no need of going into that now." She actually seemed to think that her words were comprehensible, as they probably would have been to any real resident of Eden. But they certainly were not to Styles, much less to Exberger. As for Rose, She didn't care, so far as one could tell from the absent smile with which she was still gazing down at the carpet. The matter was coming pretty close to home, however, to Styles. He had only been waiting for the proper moment to force an issue on that second and apparently more important ghost. He saw that it was no use talking to Puller, and he carried the matter to headquarters. "Really, Mrs. Puller," he begged, "let's have the story. You can't hurt my feelings." He looked very eager and deferential, and inwardly he knew that, however dubious she might consider him as an individual, Mrs. Puller could at least be made to talk to him as a member of her own class, an honor she had not accorded to everyone that evening. She did, with a little laugh. "No, Mr. Styles, you mustn't ask me." Styles looked at her whimsically. "In other words, the crater history is a closed book, a picture we do not study, a page we do not scan. But you must grant that still leaves me in the dark as to why your husband or some other given scientist could not drop a fish-hook down the copper mine." Mrs. Puller laughed again, the "dear boy" sort of laugh that a woman with graying hair would use, and, as Styles had hoped, he saw that he had established himself as an equal. "Shall I put it this way?" she asked, archly, that being the manner in which duchesses conversationally tap gay, sad dogs like Styles on the shoulder, "that in your uncle's day we did not come up here with fish-lines or for any other purpose?" She continued her smile suggestively, looking straight into Styles's eyes, and Styles looked straight back into hers. He, too, smiled with complete comprehension. "But heaven help the happy peasantry if they get too gay with that old bird," was the sentiment which rose to his mind, although it might more naturally have risen to Exberger's lips. "Come, Bobby," said Mrs. Puller, having decided that the evening was at an end, "it must be 2 o'clock." She gathered the evening wrap that she wore as she rose to her feet, and the act broke a sort of spell that had hung over the group, while the two members of the upper classes had gazed into each other's eyes and flung each other defiance. It called the others back into the conversation, for while Puller had been dreaming off on a roadside of spark plugs or trout lures or what not, Exberger had been left miles behind. Not once had he had a chance to say, "What do you mean, fish lines?" Like Baumgarten, however, the rising of the company gave Exberger an opening, and for the first time appeared in him what Styles had been looking for ever since he had known him, a trace of Baumgartenism. "Say, do you people ever get to New York?" he asked, although Baumgarten would have said, "the big city." Mrs. Puller turned sweetly from the door. "Now, happy peasantry, here's where you get yours," thought Styles with a grin as he watched the ominous suavity of her motion. "We have a great many friends in New York," she said quietly. She looked at Exberger and saw that she had not quite carried her meaning. She knew that in Styles she now had an audience. She could not leave any doubt, so she added succinctly, "But of course, New York is so changed. All our friends went on Murray Hill and down around dear old Washington Square. That shows you, Mr. Exberger, what old fogies we are." It was too much to ask, however, that a man who had never heard of Ticonderoga should be very much excited by Murray Hill. "Well, well, well," replied Exberger, in a patronage as hearty as her own, "you just leave it to me. Next time you are in town and lonely, you just telephone Bryant 4689. I'll fix you up with a box for anything you want to see. Just do that little thing, will you? And say," he shouted as an afterthought, as the car was about to move away from the gate, "if they ask what you want, tell 'em that you are particular friends of Mr. Exberger and that he told you to call." "They might have trouble in getting me," he explained to Styles as the three walked back to the house, "unless the people in the outer office knew who it was. And now, folks," he concluded, in the lamplit study, rubbing his hands briskly. "I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm going to bed." "I guess we all are," said Styles, and, as Exburger sauntered off up the big stairs, he bent over to turn down the big lamp. On the plate remained a fragment of cake. Styles took it absently. Then, looking up, he found that Miss Fuller was still in the room. "Have some?" he asked. Miss Fuller looked at the crumbs and shook her head, amused. She watched him a moment with that mild indifference of hers, and then she remarked, "We seem to have spilled your beans with Queen Victoria." Styles did not deny it. He stood as if studying minutely the fragments of cake in his hand. The deep lines around his mouth became suddenly deeper. The girl saw them. "What are you laughing at?" "I was just thinking," replied Styles, "what Exburger would have said to that." "What do you mean, spilled the beans?" The girl looked away without returning his smile, and for an instant Styles feared that he had gone too far, that he had overestimated the shrewdness with which she regarded her famous escort. Apparently, however, she was not thinking of that at all. "Well, didn't we?" she insisted. "I don't care whether you did or not," replied Styles. "Queen Victoria is nothing to me. I never saw her until tonight." Miss Fuller, however, pursued her own logic relentlessly. "I'm going to clear out. The first train in the morning." "That's not necessary," said Styles quietly. "I know it's not necessary," retorted the girl. "Well, then," replied Styles, "I ask you to stay." It happened to be that which made the girl raise her eyes slowly and look at him steadily. But if it had not been that, she would have done it just the same. It was not the remark, but the moment. Midnight in a country house, a dishevelled room, and their sudden fantastic intimacy. Such moments breed almost an intoxication of confidence. Styles looked back into the girl's eyes, which never moved. 3 or 4 times he stopped himself from saying what he felt tempted to say, each time knowing that, sooner or later, he would say it just the same. As a preliminary, he put the crumbs of cake back on the plate. The girl missed neither the gesture nor its significance. "Don't let me spoil your supper." The remark delayed the confession, but it could not avert it. At any rate, the girl did not move. Silence and the glow of the lamp restored the spell of the moment, and, in a gentler voice, only half bantering, she asked him, "Well, what's on your mind?" It was all that Styles needed. He looked at her with that same speculative smile. The truth was that the evening had shown him that the role of confessor for which he had cast Judge Tyler would in all probability be played by this girl. He began, "There are several things that I want to know." With that almost brutal acuteness with which he divined some things, the girl took him up. "You want me to tell you what Charlie Exburger is after?" Styles nodded. "And Stuffy Baumgarten, too?" He nodded again. "I'll tell you," replied the girl promptly, "but it's a long story. Only," she added, "it doesn't amount to a row of pins." "I'm not so sure of that," suggested Styles. The girl studied his face with a searching expression, almost motherly in its faint anxiety. She seemed to fear that he might still have some golden hope. "Of course," she hinted carefully, "Charlie never had any idea of buying this place for a picture park." Styles dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "I am not one of the bricks." Miss Fuller laughed. "I didn't think you were." She stood for a full minute more, looking into the fireplace in front of which Styles was standing. "It's a funny thing to say," she began at last, "but I suppose I am the mystery." Styles did not even look up. "I wondered if that were not so." The girl was surprised. What do you mean? Styles did look up then. I didn't mean just this nonsense about buying the place. I meant the real tale. You said it was a long story. I see, said the girl. She hung her head and came to a sudden stop. Styles feared, to his regret, that there might be no confession that night. A moment later, he was sure there would be none, for Exberger's voice came hurtling down from the head of the stairs. Hey there! Are you people going to stand there chewing the rug all night? And since I am unable to stand here chewing the rug all night, having to be at the office 2 hours early tomorrow, I think that's quite an excellent place to stop. Another interesting book. I'm kind of hesitant to even classify it as a mystery, but I don't even know what you would classify it as. So much time to spend with these characters and then with some of their antics. But some of the long scenes of just the character interactions, makes me think back to when we read Benighted on stream. And there's less than 10 years between the two of them. So I really haven't read that many novels from the teens and 20s. Well, it being so late, we'd best find somebody to raid. But as for what's coming up on stream, hey, Dame Karen! Welcome in. Thank you so much for the subscription. 34 months. That's so kind of you. How are you doing, Dame Karen? Saved by the need to sleep from reading all night. Need for Sleep. Sounds like a video game about cars. Or, I don't know, beds. Racing beds. A little Nemo racing game. I'd play it. But how have things been going for you, Dame Karen? I hope you're doing well. Yeah. Sad to say we're just wrapping up for the night. But I will tell you, chaps, what's coming up on stream. On Wednesday, my intention is to finish both Carol Reed 2, Hope Springs Eternal, and Doom 3, Resurrection of Evil. I know those are two games that are not often paired together, but we have very little of both of them, so it'll probably be a rather shorter stream Wednesday, just depending on how long certain final bosses take. Interesting books. Yes, I do appreciate that, Dame Karen. I try to read books that you may not have seen anywhere, and also that are in public domain, so it's legal. The need for sleep for our generations. As we all need sleep. Plodding along, I'm doing okay. It's just my taxes, which is now all wrapped up, and hopefully, and pretty busy with work, but still trying to keep, a regular streaming schedule. And not that much else. I really need more in my life other than streaming and work. I'm working on that. I hope to make progress at some projects at work soon, get things in better order, and I don't know, stick with the job though. When I'm a variety streamer, right? No, I do Stream a variety of things. A variety of things going on in my wildlife. Even if most of them are work-related. Yeah, that's what we'll do Wednesday. Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil and Carol Reed Hope Springs Eternal. And on Saturday, we'll finish the Haunted PS1 demo disc 2021. I believe we have 3 games left. And then my plan is Sunday, we'll start some adventure game or, I don't know, some random game. I don't know, maybe I'll play Mr. Smoozles Goes Nutso. Bet I'm the only one on Twitch streaming that. And then Wednesday, a week from Wednesday, we will finally start the Doom reboot. Let's get my computer and can run it. Yeah, no more taxes for another year. And this time I hope the bloody payroll company withholds the right bloody amount. If they don't, I will have to write letters. Actually, I'm going to write letters anyway. Hopefully taxes there in Australia are a slightly less arduous task than they can be here. Go ahead and see who's online. I can find somebody streaming something remotely similar. It's not bloody likely. Good Lord, somebody playing Phantasmagoria. I think we haven't rated Falsia in a minute. Or Bumfluff. M says he's doing her 3,000 follower celebration. We should probably go over and say hi to her. Wonder what abysmal DOS game she's playing now. By abysmal, I mean quite possibly wonderful. Here, if you want to do raid calls, we can type. There. Yeah. Sorry not to stick around and chat longer, but this is me playing at being a responsible adult or some such. But good to see you again, Dame Karen. Hope things go well for you. Yeah. I'll stick around and chat more on Wednesday, or endeavor to. Spell that right. Yeah. Like, I don't know how to spell these words, from colossal cave or adventure or Zork or whatever. Oregon Trail. Oh, no worries, Dame Karen. Sorry about stream freezing. Hopefully that's on your end and not mine. No offense. But thank you to everybody for coming to hang out and join another audiobook stream. I appreciate all the chatters and all the lurkers. And thank you for the subscriptions tonight. You guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and random nonsense. And I forgot to announce tonight's stream on Twitter. Oh well, a little late for that now. And you can find VODs of my past streams up on the YouTube. So I hope everybody has a good night. Don't fall down a 200-foot copper mine in a Vermont or New England cellar. And say hi to MZZ. And I'll see you guys back here on Wednesday. Yeah, that checks out.